Now listen, pull your chair in close. I'm going to tell you a story about a young woman behind a bank window, a widow in a gray coat, and the loudest year America ever had before it went quiet. But before I do, I gotta tell you about a book. A fella named Thomas Stanley and a fella named William Danko spent years knocking on the doors of American millionaires, and what they found shocked them. They wrote it up in a book called The Millionaire Next Door. And the very first line of their thesis, the one they put right near the top, is this: wealth is what you accumulate, not what you spend. Read that again in your head. Wealth is what you accumulate, not what you spend. Stanley and Danko say most folks who look rich ain't. And most folks who are rich, you'd walk past them on the sidewalk and never know it. Well, let me tell you about Clara. Clara was 26 years old, spring of 1925. She worked the third window from the left at a bank on the corner of Pine Street and Nassau, down in the financial district of New York City. Marble floors, brass cages, and outside those doors, the whole city was on fire. It was the jazz age, friends. The Charleston was in every dance hall. Model Ts were getting traded for Packards. Hemlines were rising. And down on Wall Street, the ticker tape was clattering out numbers nobody had ever dreamed of. Everybody was getting rich. Or at least, everybody was talking about getting rich. Which, Stanley and Danko will tell you, is a very different thing. And Clara stood behind her window all day and watched them come through.
There was a boy named Teddy Marsh, junior clerk at a brokerage 2 blocks over, 23 years old, two-tone shoes, silk tie, smelled like a barbershop. And Teddy would lean on Clara's counter and brag about the new apartment up on 72nd Street, and the Stutz Bearcat he was putting a down payment on, and the tailor on Madison, who made a suit finer than anything a Morgan would wear. And Clara would count out his deposit, which, week after week, was $11 and change. $11 on a Stutz Bearcat's worth of ambition. Then there was Mr. Halloran, owned 3 haberdasheries on the west side, diamond pinky ring, camel coat, gold watch you could see from across the room, bounced a check in April, bounced another in June. By August, Clara's manager had quietly put his account on a watch list. Stanley and Danko have a phrase for those folks. They borrowed it from the Texans. Big hat, no cattle. All the show of wealth, none of the actual herd. Clara didn't know the phrase yet, but she was learning the shape of it from behind her brass cage.
Now, Clara had a fiancé. His name was Henry. Henry worked at a brokerage on Broad Street, junior man, handling margin accounts. And Henry had ideas. Every Saturday, Henry would pick her up, and every Saturday, Henry would have a new proposition. Clara, put $50 on Radio Corporation. It's gonna double by Thanksgiving. Clara, let's take a better apartment up on Lexington. I can cover the rent on margin. Clara, we ought to be at the Cotton Club this weekend. What are we, shut-ins? And the hardest thing, he said, the thing that stuck in her like a splinter, was this. One night, walking home under the street lamps, he looked at her and said, "Clara, you're boring. You save every dollar like it's your last. You wear the same 2 dresses. You're 26 years old. Live a little." Now, I want you all to hear me, because that line right there, that line has ended more fortunes than the crash of 1929 ever did. Live a little. It sounds harmless. It sounds loving, even. But Stanley and Danko spent their entire careers studying people who built real wealth. And you know what they found? They found that the people who accumulated fortunes did it by what the authors called playing great defense. Defense. Meaning being careful, disciplined, deliberate about what goes out the door. They write, and I'm paraphrasing here, the foundation stone of building wealth is defense.
anchored by budgeting and planning. Henry was all offense. He wanted the income, the apartment, the Packard, the dance floor. And every dollar he earned was spoken for before it even landed in his pocket. Clara went home that night and cried, because maybe Henry was right. Maybe she was boring.
Then came Mrs. Alcott. Mrs. Alcott was 60-something, a widow. Came in every other Tuesday. And she wore, I am not kidding you, the same gray wool coat every single time. A little threadbare at the cuffs, a mended pocket. And she'd slide her passbook across the counter to Clara and make a small deposit. Never a withdrawal. Never. And one rainy afternoon in September of 25, Clara, out of curiosity, out of pity maybe, glanced down at Mrs. Alcott's balance. And her breath caught in her throat. Because Mrs. Alcott, in that patched grey coat, with the umbrella she'd had since the Taft administration, Mrs. Alcott had more money in that bank than any 3 men Clara served in a week. More than Teddy Marsh would see in his life. Clara looked up, and Mrs. Alcott was watching her. Not angry, just knowing. And Mrs. Alcott said, very softly, "My dear, the man who has to show you his money doesn't have any. And the one who keeps his quiet usually has plenty." Then she patted Clara's hand and walked out into the rain in that same grey coat. Something shifted in Clara after that. She started watching the bank different, started noticing. The men in the 2-tone shoes were always 1 week from a bounced check. The quiet ones, the fella who drove a Model T from 1919 and ran a hardware store in the Bronx, the seamstress who lived over her own shop, the Polish plumber who always paid cash. Those were the ones whose accounts grew like oak trees. Slow, steady, deep-rooted. Stanley and Danko, in their book, they give you a name for these 2 kinds of people. They call the quiet wealthy ones Prodigious Accumulators of Wealth. PAWs. People whose net worth is way more than you'd guess from their income. And they call the showy ones Under Accumulators of Wealth. UAWs. People whose net worth is way less than their paycheck says it should be. Same income, friends. Totally different outcomes. The difference isn't what comes in, it's what stays. Clara didn't know the terms, but she'd figured out the pattern, and she kept saving. $12 a week, sometimes $15, into a little account under her own name, not Henry's. Every Friday without fail. Henry teased her about it, called it her shoebox money, told her she was leaving fortunes on the table. She just smiled and kept stacking. And then came October of 1929. You all know the date. October 29th. Black Tuesday. The day the ticker tape couldn't keep up with the falling. The day the brokerages on Broad Street went quiet as churches. The day men in 2-tone shoes stood on the curb with their hands in their empty pockets, staring at nothing. Teddy Marsh's Stutz Bearcat sold. His apartment on 72nd, gone. He was back living with his mother in Yonkers by Thanksgiving. Mr. Halloran's 3 haberdasheries shuttered, plywood on the windows. The brokerage where Henry worked, the office was empty by November. Desks cleared, phones disconnected. The margin accounts he'd managed had evaporated into thin air, taking everyone who'd trusted them down with them. And Henry, poor Henry, came to Clara's door one cold evening in December. Coat collar turned up, eyes tired. And he just stood there on the stoop and said, "Clara, I was wrong about all of it. I was wrong." And Clara
Clara put the kettle on, because that's what you do. She didn't gloat, she didn't lecture. She sat him down at her kitchen table and she showed him her passbook. 4 years of Fridays, $12 at a time, still there, still hers, growing quietly, while the whole city had been screaming about easy money. And Mrs. Alcott? Mrs. Alcott walked into the bank the very next Tuesday. Same grey coat, same mended pocket. Made her deposit, didn't flinch. Because a woman who never pretended to be rich had nothing to pretend away. Stanley and Danko list 7 traits of the people who build real wealth. The very first one, number 1 on the list, is this. They live well below their means. Not below their wants, not below their neighbors, below their means. Mrs. Alcott lived below hers. Clara learned to. Teddy Marsh and Mr. Halloran and poor flashy Henry, they lived above theirs. And when the tide went out, there was nothing underneath. Stanley and Danko say it plain. They say, if you make a good income every year and spend it all, you are not getting wealthier. You are just living high. And living high is a very different thing from being rich. Let me ask you something tonight, friend. When you walk through your life, your neighborhood, your office, the grocery store, who do you think is the wealthy one? The fella with the new truck in the driveway? The neighbor with the boat? The co-worker who just got back from Paris? Or is it the quiet one? The one in the same coat for a decade? The one who brings lunch from home? The one you've never thought about twice? Stanley and Danko will tell you, it's almost always the quiet one. Almost always the one in the grey coat. So here's my question, and I want you to sit with it. What's your grey coat? What's the piece of showing off you could lay down this week? The upgrade you don't need? The dinner you don't need? The car payment that's eating your future alive? So that 20 years from now, you're the one still standing when everybody else's Stutz Bearcat gets repossessed. I'd love to hear it. Drop it in the comments. And if you want to read the book that taught me all this, pick up The Millionaire Next Door by Thomas Stanley and William Danko. It'll rearrange the way you look at every driveway you pass. Now, if this old grandpa's story warmed you up a little tonight, do me a small kindness. Tap that like button. Subscribe so I can find you next week with another story. And read the book. Read it slow. Because the loud money, it always runs out. But the quiet money, the patient money, the grey coat money, that one, friend, that one outlasts the crash.